Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Sage 300 Operations Suite. We're going to be doing the tips and tricks. So there's so many tips and tricks that it was hard for me to sort them out. So bear with me. I picked the things that I thought would be most useful if I didn't know what they were. So yeah, and I'm Heather Williamson, for those of you who have not been in the previous sessions. And I'm a senior business consultant here with BAASS in the Western region. I've been working with inventory control, order entry, purchase order, project and job cost, all for many years, before the new century started, I'll tell you that much. So yeah, so welcome. Here's our topics that we're going to try and cover in this session. The case study that we have come across, an issue that a customer was having with vendor costs, and we're going to take a look at that. The create purchase orders automations that come with Sage 300. The using the templates in accounts, in order entry and purchase order, which is a fun and useful tool, and understanding the AP clearing functions. So the case study, I'm going to just turn my camera off so that you can see this better. There we go. So the problem that was being encountered is that the purchase orders, now these were purchase orders being created manually, not generated using automation. But the what was happening was that because of all the issues with the pandemic, the shipping and the inflation and everything else, the this situation was such that the customer used to import their vendor costs usually annually when they got the new price list updates. The vendor would send them the new costs. They would copy and paste that into an import. They'd import it into their vendor details area, which we're going to take a look at here in a second. But the problem was that when they received goods that were ordered under a previous price list, the receiving and the invoicing was updating the vendor costs. So, and that is a feature that Sage 300 will do. It'll automatically update the vendor costs. But because they had new prices from their vendors, they didn't want that. So we had to find a way that they could still issue their purchase orders using the new price lists and continue to receive goods with the old prices and not have updates and overrides. So that was where we are looking at changing them over to the new PO vendor contract costs instead. So we're going to take a look at that. Okay, so I'm going to just change screens. Okay, here we are. So the original issue was that the vendor, so we looked at vendor details in the first session, part one. And here is where we had the vendor costs entered, $10 for this vendor, $15 for the Canadian vendor. And, that works pretty well for almost everyone. And this actually drives the create purchase orders when you're generating purchase orders from the system. But yes, when we receive, it was updating this with an older cost. And then of course they were going and putting in their POs with the with the old cost. And so that was causing some grief. So when we go to the purchase order setup area, and we'll just take a quick look here, I'll show you what you've got the ability to do. So the system default item cost was selected here as vendor cost. We have the ability to put any number of other costs in here, but most of these are calculated except for standard and landed are the two that we are user-defined costs. And of course, the vendor cost was the one that was being used. So there's, just a few versions ago, they came through with the vendor contract costs. And this gives us a lot more features for these items, more than what vendor costs had. So at the top end, it does look almost the same. We selected our vendor by vendor number. It shows their currency and the case, the base cost for that currency, and so on. However, when we get inside here, we also have some other new features that are useful. It's actually a lot like our price lists. So we can calculate these costs based on single or multiple units of measure. Just like in price lists, we can do a cost plus with a fixed amount or percentage. And in this case, I just went with the base unit. And then we can also have a sale price as well. It's like we did on the price lists. But we also have volume discounts available for these costs. So if your vendor is offering you discounts, the more you buy, the more you discounts, this will also calculate for you. Okay. So this is what we would have to do in order to accommodate the client's request. So I go in here to my purchase order entry, and now I got to remember which vendor it was. Okay. And now it's inserting the correct cost. I don't know if you noticed this notes jumped up on the right-hand side. This is came a couple of, it's been 2 or 3 versions now that we've had the notes available. And we can put notes on any number of things, items, customers, vendors, but it does have to be installed. And if you decide you don't like it, it has to be uninstalled. So not everybody likes it, but I like it. Okay, so I'm going to just add a few of these in here. Okay, so that was the override for the case issue. Now the next thing is to use the create purchase orders function, which is located here under create purchase orders. And this is an automation for your purchase order creations. Now, some companies will use requisitions instead of purchase orders. They'll go into the PO transactions, they enter a requisition, and this requisition entry is just kind of a request. It's not confirmed. It's not saved anywhere as being on a pending thing. It's just, this is my wish list. And so you can come along and you can review these requisitions and approve them, and then go to the create purchase orders and generate POs from these requisitions. We also have create POs from orders. And so in this case, this one would be any orders that, so if you say only items on back order or only items with insufficient quantities, and they have to meet all this criteria in order to create the new purchase orders. It does use the vendors 1 through 9, which are located in the original vendor costs, detail costs that we were looking at earlier. And then my personal favorite is the create POs from IC. So here is where we set our reorder quantities, and we said we wanted, minimums, we wanted maximums, projected sales, I believe, and yeah, that was it. And so in this case, we can, do some preparation on our items, and as long as we're using the reorder quantities, we can come in here and generate POs from this. Now, obviously, you're going to want to print the reports first to make sure that you're not going to get a whole bunch of POs that you can't afford. And you can narrow this down to 1 or 2 particular vendors. So I'm going to just say the first 3 vendors here so that I don't get, 500 POs. Go like that. You might have a specific item number range, a specific location, or all locations. And if the vendor is number 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, of course, you don't want to have too many of these because your second choice, third choice, you could end up with a PO for both. So I'm going to just order all items up to a maximum. Most of the time we would order below minimum, but I know that I don't have any below minimum right now, so I'm going to hit process, and it's created a new purchase order number 35. Okay, so there's my new purchase order, and it did identify one particular item that had was able to order some quantities at these 2 locations that didn't meet that did meet the criteria. The other ones were all stocked up well. And it does use the vendor details cost, the one located up in inventory control. So that is, one issue with our case study that still needs to be addressed. And yeah, so it's placed the order for us. It's compiled it into one purchase order for us, and it's ready to go. All I have to do now is, post and put my notes in and print or email this to my vendor. And for those of you who are not aware, it is still possible to print these to straight to email by selecting the vendor delivery method. And you can have a cover letter in, mail merge type email cover that the attachment will go with. So when you hit this, as long as you have your server credentials set up in your common services, then this will send the POs out to the vendors. Another issue that comes up quite a lot is the issue of the templates. So in the setup for PO and for OE, we do have templates in here. What these templates do is it allows us to create a default for what we want to the most of the POs to contain. So if we look at the vendor tab, you see it's got a ship via in here, it's got a tax group, and it's got terms. Most of the time, we want the vendor terms and the vendor tax group and things to override this. So that means we would have to have the template selected before we select the vendor. There are multiple types of POs and templates. As you can see here, we got blanket POs, we've got different regions, future, and so on. So, but at the moment, we can only have the one template. I know there's been a request into a future version here to be able to identify the template on the vendor file, and again on order entry on the customer file. We're waiting for that to come. I'm not sure what version that's going to come out on. But here's the issue. If we go into purchase orders and we go into the interface, and I don't select my template before my vendor, naturally, because of the way the menu is set up, right? You see how I was getting errors earlier about the location? Because these are not populated. If I select my template now, it'll populate the location and the ship via, all right? But it may or may not be using the right terms for this vendor. It's doing the terms that I said in the template. So the idea is to select your template first, or make it the default template in your company profile. So now I've got everything in here already, but when I select my my vendor, then it brings in the preferred ship via and the preferred terms code from that vendor. And then I can carry on. It already knows now what location I want. I don't keep getting these errors. Okay, same thing goes on the vendor side or on the customer side with order entry. We have templates here as well. And one of the other ways to manage this is to put the template in as the default. So again, you see the customer. I set all these variables, but what if it's a Canadian customer? I don't want it to use a US price list. So I really do need to have the template in there first. We can also have some standard descriptions, reference, and comments already in here as well. So for example, description is more of an internal description unless you ask for a customization to put it on the invoice. So, this might be something that you want them to type, the operator to type in here for internal purposes. And then here you might want, a job number or something, some kind of reference. So let's look at how that's going to work. So if you go into your options, and the same thing applies to the order entry. And we can come in here and set our template. Default template code is here. Okay. Save. Now, if we had to change that, we'd have to do that on the fly, the same way I showed you on the PO, where it needs to be put in before the vendor or customer is brought in. But now you see the template code is already here. So when I select my customer, and depending on who it is, this will come in and override the customer's preferred ship via and their preferred everything. And then it's got my comments and descriptions in here. So all they have to do is just add to it. And then this, would be the description that the customer wants and so on. And it already knows, it should already know the location. I don't see it here, but there it is. So it's automatically inserted the location. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Okay. I know it's hard to get excited about accounting sometimes, but I think it's great. I have a lot of fun here. Okay, so now the last item here is understanding the AP clearing. So when we do a receipt for a purchase order, what happens is that the system generates like a temporary payable, because once we've received something, it belongs to us, right? And so we're going to have to pay for it sooner or later. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to just receive one of these POs. Here we go. All right. And so I don't have the invoice yet. So it feels kind of like it's going into the ether, if you know what I mean. It's where did it go? It's not in payables. When I run my day in processing, this purchase order is going to be processed. This receipt is going to be processed, and it's going to be dropped into an account that we've identified as AP clearing. So it usually sits in the current liabilities section or the payables liabilities section of your balance sheet. And we're going to just take a look at this journal entry. Okay, so here's the stock that's been received. It's definitely the same PO. It's gone in as a debit to inventory, which is what we want, but it needs to go to payables. And at the moment, I don't have an invoice, so I can't pay it. But it sits in accounts payable clearing, or if you want to call it AP clearing, and it'll sit there as a liability until such time as we get the invoice from the vendor. Now, for those of you who were in my class on PJC, the project and job cost, you'll know that that's a problem there too, right? So now when I go in and I do the invoice, and I can apply that invoice against this receipt. I'll just go to the bottom. Okay, so there's my invoice, and I'm just going to post it. Now, again, I have to run day-end processing to get the transactions over to the other subledgers. So this is an area where a lot of times we have other settings for day-end processing, such as the post during. It should here cost during posting, run create subledger transactions during posting and this type of thing. We can adjust these settings so that it runs the day end automatically. However, if you have a high volume of transactions, it does slow it down. It runs this little thing every time, and the operators might find it frustrating. So yeah, so we like to kind of keep it as fast as possible. So now that that's been run, we'll be able to go and see the invoices sitting in accounts payable. And this shows you the integration between the modules. It's very tight. And I'm just going to open this. And so here you go with the amount that we were invoiced plus the taxes and all the terms. And it's coming out of accounts payable clearing. So now that's at zero. What happens at month end, though, if you look, and of course you always will have a balance most likely running in there over the month end because we don't always get the invoices very promptly. So what you can do at month end is you can go to the PO analytical reports and you can run the payables clearing audit list. This is from and to a particular time frame. So you may want to do a wider range. But most of the clients I've worked with, once they get this reconciled, they start doing this on a monthly basis. Then we can look at it in either source or functional currency. And so you can see here, this was just in this month. And the one that we just ran has cleared through equally. However, this usually is an accumulated balance from a long time ago. How far back you want to go is up to you. Most people only going to go back to the current fiscal year. And we would show how much is still outstanding. And these would be not equal. So you would have to go in and match them together. So this is a lesser known item. There are some issues with it sometimes with backdating. The receipt might come in, say today, but the invoice was actually dated October 31st. Then in that case, the debit's going to be in October and the credit's going to be in November, and you would need to match those up. So, but ideally, there is an audit trail on it, even though we don't necessarily have to look at it every day. Okay. Cool, right? All right. So I think that's it for the tips and tricks for today. That's all we have time for. I'm just going to slip back over to my slides. And yeah, so I'm sure you're going to have questions. I know you will. We're going to be doing a session shortly where we're going to address all the questions for all the sessions that we did today. And so if you have any questions specifically, you want to get them into the chat box or be prepared. We may not be able to get to everyone, so we'll get a hold of you afterwards if there's any other specific questions. And thank you so much for bearing with me this afternoon. It's been a bit of a long day already, but at least for me, I hope it was enjoyable for you. And we'll talk to you again in a few minutes. Bye now.